Good evening. Tonight we start with something bright and dark. Phosphorus, the element that lit our world, but also carried a terrible price. It once earned the name the devil's element, for the way it could slowly rot away jaws. Forget the gentle spark of a Machu Picchu. The real story of phosphorus is much darker. A tale of poison, smoke, sick workers and slow industrial harm. Step into a match factory in the 1800 seconds, and you would not leave the same person. Workers faced hollowed faces, loose teeth. A daily fight for survival, just to do their job. If you like this story, give us a like, and subscribe to our channel. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from. I love seeing all the different places people join us. Turn off your phone, take a breath, and let us begin. Chapter 1, The Alchemist's Slide. The year was 1616 in Hamburg. A man named Hennig Brand worked in his workshop. He was an alchemist, a seeker of secrets. He believed he could find gold in unusual places. Brand had a strange idea. He thought he could find precious metals in human urine. It was cheap and there was plenty of it. So he began a long, messy experiment. He collected barrels of urine and let it sit and sour. He boiled it and distilled it again and again. The smell was terrible, the work was hard. He turned the liquid waste into a thick black paste. One night he heated this paste in a glass vessel. A vapor rose and then something amazing happened. A waxy white solid formed and it glowed in the dark. It gave off a soft greenish light with no flame. He had not found gold. He had found something completely new. A cold fire that shone on its own. He called it phosphorus, the light bringer. Brand tried to keep his discovery a secret. Secrets were valuable to an alchemist. He tried to sell the secret for money. But secrets are hard to keep. Samples were passed around and others learned the method. News spread from his small shop across Europe. This was not just a theory in a book. This was a real thing you could hold. A curiosity that could glow on a table. At the time, people only knew a few basic elements. Earth, air, fire, water, and some metals. This glowing white wax was a new kind of problem. What exactly was this stuff? Other chemists finally pieced together his method. It was both simple and disgusting. Collect urine, let it go sour and evaporate it. Heat the leftovers with sand and charcoal. Collect what comes out and store it underwater. The process required huge amounts of urine. Hundreds of liters for just a little glow. The first new element in ages came from human waste. Word traveled fast through letters and gossip. Within 10 years, labs across Europe had samples. Men like Robert Boyle in London studied it seriously. The Royal Society was fascinated by this new wonder. Science was changing from magic to observation. They noted its properties. It burned, it glowed in the dark. It produced a white acidic smoke when it burned. It dissolved in certain liquids, and it had to be kept underwater or it would catch fire. This last trait, its hunger for air, would become very important. Early descriptions were full of wonder. The greenish glow of a chip in a dark box, a small hiss when it ignited. But there was also a hidden danger. White phosphorus is a slow and clever poison. Its vapors settled on skin and clothes, and then into bone. This human cost was not clear to Brand at first, but it would create a huge social problem later. For now, phosphorus moved from secret magic into real science. The late 1600 seconds was a time of experiment and debate. Coffee houses and salons buzzed with new ideas. Phosphorus was a perfect, curious toy for these men. They could make it, burn it, and weigh it. They saw it produced a heavy white ash when it burned. This fact would help change science forever. A popular theory said burning released a substance called phlogiston, but when phosphorus burned it got heavier. This did not fit the old theory. A century later, one Lavoisier in Paris used phosphorus. He showed that burning means combining with air with oxygen. The weight increase was a key clue. This helped end the old phlogiston theory and began modern chemistry. So in just over a century, phosphorus went from alchemist's secret to a proper element. Lavoisier put it on his list of elements in 1789, not because he could break it down, but because he could not. It behaved like a basic building block. Chemists now had a new word for it: glow phosphorescence. Light without heat. The modern explanation came later. A slow reaction with air that gives off light. But seeing was enough to spark new thoughts. Light without flame matter from waste. As more chemists made phosphorus, it became a lab superstar. It could thrill and frighten. Touch it and you might be poisoned. Show it to a rich patron and you might get funding. Burn it and you could demonstrate the new science of air. Robert Boyle in England did careful experiments. In Germany and Holland, glass makers improved the tools. Better jaws and scales meant less guesswork. Specimens and letters crossed borders. This culture of repeatable tests is the heart of modern science. The odd traits of phosphorus forced new thinking. It ignites when warm makes acidic smoke glows in the dark. And it damages human tissue in a terrible way. These facts did not fit the old world of magic. A new language was born: elements, compounds, oxides. And later the idea of allotropes. Different forms of the same element. From one nun's urine to labs across Europe. From secret magic to Lavoisier restless. The path was slow and messy, but it stuck. Brand did more than find a strange light. He left a problem that helped shape chemistry itself. The need for tests anyone can repeat. The need to measure carefully. And the courage to drop old theories when facts disagree. The alchemist's light taught a new generation how to see. Once in the world of modern science, phosphorus became a sensation. Everyone wanted to see it. It could be distilled, stored underwater, or shaved into chips that glowed. Each demo was a great party trick and a real experiment. Chemists listed its reactions. Heated in a closed space, it would darken and then burst into flame, releasing a vivid white smoke that seemed to eat moisture. That smoke was an oxide, a powerful drying agent. It reacted violently with water to make strong acid. They watched and they weighed. All these observations pressed on a big question. What is an element really? Phosphorus acted differently from metals. It burned like a candle, but left a residue that dissolved in acid. In the 1700 seconds, debates about errand burning made phosphorus key. It combined visible light with a clear change in weight. Lavoisier Resteen used it to prove burning is about adding something from air. The old theory struggled to explain the weight gain, but the scales did not lie. By the early 1800 seconds, chemists looked deeper. They studied composition and how atoms bond. The term allotrope was born for different forms of one element. Phosphorus was the textbook example. It refused to be just one thing. This became clear when chemists found its main forms. White phosphorus, the waxy reactive form Brand found. Its molecules are 4 atoms in a tight strained pyramid. This strain makes it eager to react, especially with oxygen. That is why it glows and burns so easily. It is volatile and can ignite in air, so it is stored in water. It is also fat-soluble, which let it enter the body easily. And it is poisonous. The 1800 seconds learned this the hard way. When industry found a use for white phosphorus, caution was lost. The big use was in matches. In the 1830 seconds, a Frenchman, Charles Saury, put it in match heads. The result was a cheap, reliable match that lit anywhere. It was a commercial success, but the vapor and dust settled on workers' hands and clothes. It built up in poorly ventilated workshops. Over time, many workers got a terrible jaw disease. It was called false-eye jaw. Teeth loosened, abscesses formed, bone died. Employers often ignored the suffering. The danger was both chemical and social. A failure of industry to protect people. The social impact was huge. At the Bryant and May match factory in London, thousands of women and girls worked in bad conditions. The match girls' strike of 1888 was a protest about wages and safety. It turned public eyes to the human cost of cheap matches. Photos showed girls with bandaged, swollen jaws. The strike did not fix everything, but it started a conversation. Meanwhile, chemists looked for a technical fix. They found it in another form of phosphorus, red phosphorus. An Austrian chemist discovered it in the 1800 second. You make it by heating white phosphorus without air. Red phosphorus is a polymer, a chain of atoms. This structure removes the strain and makes it much less reactive. It does not glow, it does not ignite on its own, it is much safer. The industrial use was immediate. In 1840, the Swedish inventor Gustav Fredrik Pask had an idea. Put the safer red phosphorus on the striking surface of the matchbox. Keep the dangerous white phosphorus out of the match head. Strike the match and the friction on the red patch creates heat. This heat lights the safer chemicals on the match. Pask's safety match was perfected by Johan Edvard Lundström. It made matches much less dangerous for workers. The market slowly followed. Social pressure and smart design reduced the moral hazard. But the story of phosphorus forms does not end there. There is also black phosphorus, a dark, shiny form. It looks like graphite with sheets of atoms. These sheets can be peeled into thin films. Black phosphorus is stable and acts like a semiconductor. In the 21st century, scientists make ultra-thin layers called phosphorus. It promises new kinds of tiny electronics. Science is patient. An element that once made parlor tricks now may power future computers. At the atomic level, these differences make sense. White phosphorus has strained molecules eager to react. Red phosphorus has relaxed chains much calmer. Black phosphorus forms flat sheets good for electronics. The same atom in different patterns becomes fire or a safe striker or a computer chip. This variety taught chemists a vital lesson. Atoms are social, how they arrange is as important as what they are. The periodic table gave phosphorus a family, but the allotropes showed one element can wear many masks. Why does this matter outside the lab? Because scale changes everything. A molecule's shape affects how we handle it. Handling affects workplaces. Workplaces affect public health and law. The match industry's reliance on white phosphorus turned a lab curiosity into a public danger. Then, it became a political issue linking science and workers' rights. The fixed red phosphorus and safety match needed smart science. It also needed business will and finally international law. In 1906, a treaty in Bern began to curb white phosphorus in matches. National laws and better practices followed. White phosphorus was largely removed from household. The devil had been muzzled by design and regulation. Yet phosphorus never lost its power to surprise. Its oxides and acids found uses everywhere. Phosphorus compounds became vital for fertilizers, detergents and more. Some organophosph subcompounds have peaceful uses, others are terrible weapons. In the scope of safety and science, the allotropes teach a lesson. The same element can shine, rot and save. It all depends on the form we choose. The man in Hamburg boiling year and did not foresee global markets or tragedies. He was just practicing his craft. His strange light showed a path from secret magic to public science. A science that could count, weigh and regulate. So the story curves from the smell of rot to the periodic table. From the hunger of a burning chip to the patience of laws. It is an anatomy of change. The simple acts of science collect, heat, weigh, observe, became tools for social change. The alchemist wanted gold, but found light. That light, bright and dangerous, taught Europe to make chemistry both a show and a discipline. The elements' many faces, white, red, black, are more than science curiosities. They mark human choices. How we make our conveniences, how we care for workers, how we turn nature's language into systems of law and safety. Listen to the past and you can hear it. The first light greedy in bronze hand, then a lab's clinical curiosity, then the match factories where money and health clashed. Now the thin sheets of black phosphorus, a bridge to future electronics. The tale teaches that materials remember more than people do. The traits of an atom multiplied across thousands of hands create a history of consequences. As luminescent, as stubborn as that first pale glow in a Hamburg jar. Hennig Brand's stubborn curiosity. Eimann in 1616, distilling his own urine. That private miracle started it all. He called it phosphorus, the light bringer. He kept it secret for a while. But what made phosphorus useful was not its poetry. It was its blunt chemistry. That oily wax could be made from phosphate compounds with heat. Once the recipe leaked, the practical minds of Europe got to work. They turned an alchemist's toy into an industrial staple. Early makers used brands or full recipe. For decades, they distilled human urine or other waste. It was horrible work and very inefficient. Industry hates inefficiency. By the late 1700s, people asked a better question. What is cheap, plentiful and full of phosphorus? The answer was bones. Cities had slaughterhouses and tanneries. They produced mountains of animal bones. Bones contained phosphate as calcium phosphate. Burned bones leave a chalky ash rich in phosphate. This shift from urine to bone was chemical and practical. Bones could be gathered, taxed and shipped. Entire trades rose around collecting bones from city alleys. Railway wagons carried loads of skeletons to factories. Bone mills stood beside lime kilns, their chimneys smoking. The smell was acrid and animal. The sight of bone piles was common in industrial areas. Workers processed the bones systematically. First clean and break them, then burn them in kilns. The white ash left was rich in calcium phosphate. There were two main ways to use it. One was thermal reduction back to bronze glowing product. Mix the ash with silica and charcoal. Heat it in a furnace until carbon steals the oxygen. Phosphorus vapor is released. The vapor condenses in cool air as a pale oily liquid. White phosphorus stored underwater. The other way was wet and chemical. Treat the phosphate with sulfuric acid. This makes soluble phosphoric acid for farmers' fields. Both fruits had their own machines and economies. The furnace method needed high heat, lots of fuel and strong retorts. It made nasty gases and slag. Factories needed steady supplies of bones and coal. The wet acid method needed sulfuric acid and a different supply chain. Acid plant storage, vats and pumps. The chemical reaction is simple. Calcium phosphate plus sulfuric acid makes phosphoric acid and gypsum. The gypsum was a bulky waste to dump. This was the trick behind superphosphate fertilizer. John Bennet Laws in England made it a business in the 1840s. He patented the process and set up commercial production. Farmers no longer had to wait for manure. Inert rock could be turned into plant food. The German chemist Justus von Liebig preached this new agricultural science. Crops need mineral, nutrient, and phosphorus is essential. Once industry could make soluble phosphorus, demand soared. Scale changed everything. Bones were not enough. There are only so many animal carcasses. Even with city slaughterhouses, bones got expensive. Mining took over. Phosphate rock deposits around the world were larger and cheaper. The 1800s learned that industry can reshape what nature provides. Phosphate beds in Europe, the southeastern US, North Africa and Pacific Island became the new mines for a hungry world. Mines in Florida and South Carolina, the Guano Islands of Peru and the Pacific. Each became a node in the global phosphorus trade, or went to chemical works. Works turned ore into acids and elemental phosphorus. Elemental phosphorus went to matchmakers and toy makers. The furnace method remained the way to make white phosphorus, that luminous reactive form. The chemistry is straightforward. Heat calcium phosphate, silica, and carbon together. Carbon reduces the phosphorus. P for vapor forms and is collected under cold water. The retorts evolved from clay pots to big engineered systems. They were dangerous, spouting hot vapors. Workers had to be quick and steady. The product was stored underwater in jars. The retort process left behind glassy slag and a terrible smell. Sulphurous and sweet with notes of burnt animal. This was an industrial choreography. Bone collectors passed bones to chemical works linked to retorts and acid plants. Output were soluble fertilizers or elemental phosphorus. Coal and coke fed the furnaces. Sulfur fed the acid vats. Railway timetables were set for these factories. Markets set the rhythm. By the mid-1800s, the chemistry was not quaint, it was logistical. How many tons of bone for a ton of phosphorus? How many wagons to feed a retort? How many shiploads of rock for a season's fertilizer? Business people kept books and counted profit. Demand exploded with the invention of the match. A match is simple at wig with a head that ignites, but its history is key to the phosphorus story. English chemist John Walker made a friction match in 1826. It worked sometimes and showed the idea was possible. The big change came in 1830 in Paris. Charles Sourier put white phosphorus in match heads. His recipe made matches reliable and cheap. They would strike anywhere. The small task of lighting a fire became trivial. A single match could light a lamp, start a stove, or light a pipe. Households no longer needed an expert, just a box of sticks. This convenience became a huge industry. Match factories multiplied. Makers learned to make heads by the thousands, dipping sticks back in boxes, shipping pallets. Within decades, match use soared. The market was enormous. Why white phosphorus? Because it worked and was cheap. It could be mixed into paste and put right on the match head. Safety matches with red phosphorus on the box were invented in Sweden. Gustav Ferret Pask in 1840, and Johann Edvard Lundström in the 1852. But they needed a new production model and cost more at first. Swedish companies invested in the safer tech and built an export business. Other countries kept the cheaper white phosphorus method. The result was a competitive market. Makers who saved a few pennies could undercut rivals. Profit pushed design until public outcry forced a change. Britain's Bryant May, founded in 1843, became a symbol. A thriving London business, it employed many women and girls. They did the detailed work of coating match heads and boxing them. Industrialists liked female labor, it was cheaper. Conditions were cramped. White phosphorus based in fumes filled the rooms. The match girls of London, their hands stained, their lives ruled by fines. They would later make headlines. The match girls' strike of 1888 at Bryant and May started over wages and harsh rules. It caught the public imagination. Annie Besant wrote and campaigned for the girls. Her exposures made the factory-esque conditions a public issue. The strike was not just about money, it was about making suffering visible. The girls and their allies linked cheap products to human cost. The human cost was specific and grim. White phosphorus, reliable for ignition, was lethal over time. The worst result was phosphorus necrosis of the jaw, as side jaw, a disease that became an emblem of the industry's moral failure. The symptoms were clear: a lasting touch, swelling in the jaw, loose teeth, a mouth that would not heal. Over months, infection spread, bone died. Dead bone fragments came out, fistulas opened, ulcers formed. The smell was foul, breath was bad. Without antibiotics, doctors had blunt tools. Pulled teeth cut out rotten bones, sometimes removed part of the jaw. Antiseptics could reduce infection, but not stop the toxic process. The mechanism was slowly understood. White phosphorus is fat-soluble. It enters the body by breathing or through the mouth. In match factories, workers ate at benches, dampened hands with mouths. Fingers were contaminated with paste. Once inside the body, it targeted the jaw. Some mix of exposure and blood supply made the jawbone vulnerable. Doctors across Europe and America published similar sad cases. Young workers with jaws that would not heal. Lives narrowed by pain and disfigurement. Activists and journalists used the dramatic image. Stories of jaws that glowed in the dark haunted the public. Photos and medical plates showed ulcerated mouths. The narrative was powerful. Matchmakers sold light at the cost of human flesh. Workers told of months of pain, losing teeth, collapsing faces. The press dramatized it, doctors documented it. The combination made a gruesome brand for the campaign against white phosphorus. Regulation was slow. Makers argued the disease was rare. They said economic benefits outweighed a few tragedies. They were right about the meth. Switching to red phosphorus cost money and changed supply lines. But morally they were wrong. Response varied by place. Swedish makers who invented the safety match shifted early. In Britain and the US, existing factories had inertia, price pressure was greater. Change took decades, not months. International pressure grew in the late 1800 seconds and early 1900 seconds. The 1888 strike created sympathy and political talk. Scientists and reformers documented the disease and lobbied governments. An international agreement began to form. By the time of conferences in Bern, governments had to face the optics. A cheap commodity that slowly ate faces. Treaties and laws moved the problem into public view. Medical remedies were surgical cut out the dead bone. Cleanliness, better ventilation, moving workers helped individuals, but did not stop the disease at its shore. Compensation was uneven. Some employers paid, some workers got nothing. Laws trailed behind chemistry. Only with modern hygiene learned, safer tech did force such a decline. To control the disease meant retooling factories, changing match head chemistry, installing ventilation, closing old retorts. It meant rethinking supply chains, moving to safer fertilizers, or spending capital on the safety match model. It also meant shifting what customers expected. Cheap matches had made lighting instant. People were not ready to pay more without a reason. The reason came in pamphlets, exposes, court cases and pictures. It came in new factory laws and inspectors. It came in international pressure that hurt the reputation of resistant companies. Environmental costs gained too, making white phosphorus left glassy slag and glowing waste. The wet process made mountains of phosphogypsum to dump. Acid plants poisoned rivers, fish and plants suffered. Phosphate mining stripped soils and scarred landscapes. Later fertilizer runoff fed algae blooms in lakes and seas, an ecological problem that grew in the 20th century. The phosphorus boom reshaped not just factories but landscapes and diets. The pace of reform and the hunger for profit made the story ironic. The same chemical that made home life easier quietly made some lives miserable. The media loved the contrast, activists loved the moral clarity. Makers loved the market science, loved the problem politics, loved the arithmetic. Jobs versus rules, export versus liability. But the human story is not just arithmetic. It is how an element found in a dark room, boiled from pee, trickled through society into the mouths of factory girls and the soil of fields. The clinical picture of Phos-Sci, jaw its slow grind, was central to reform. Doctors in London, Paris, Berlin wrote careful articles. They described stages. First elasting to fetch, then swelling unfistulous, then exposed dead bone. The smell was foul, the social stigma brutal. A diseased body could not be hidden. Photos for medical legal reasons circulate. Worker testimony, often from women, was printed and read in Parliament. These plain, terrible accounts were effective. The late 1800 seconds and early 1900 seconds saw pressure build until things changed. Faster adoption of safety matches in some nations. International agreements against white phosphorus. Better industrial hygiene reduced new cases. Surgery improved and later antibiotics changed the prognosis. A disfiguring, oft unfatal disease became manageable. But the memories remained a cautionary tale. You can trace the ripples of change. The shift from urine to bones to phosphate rock changed how we see raw materials. The logistics, bone collectors, retorts, acid fats, mines, railways, showed chemistry needs infrastructure to be more than a curiosity. The social fallout, cheap matches and their habits. Exploitation of female labor, slow litigation, clumsy laws. All part of the element's history as much as crushed rock. Phos-Sci jaw is not just a medical story. It is a social story, an index of what industry paid for convenience, and what it did later to fix the cost. There is a grim humor in the tale. Phosphorus was brilliant and was paid for in tons. It gave the world instant light, and in return it made workers breathe, eat and touch a substance. So chemically eager, it would steal from the body itself. The glow that delighted Brand's lab became a ledger. Towns balanced profit and loss on it. Factories that smoked in the evening, matchboxes bought by thousands. Farmers who spread surpassed hate and got bigger harvests. Surgeons with crude tools trying to fix what industry broke. We can see the elements of the response. Adopting the wet acid route for fertilizers, cheaper, less toxic. Industrial retooling to safety matches. The start of environmental awareness counting disposal as it cost, medical knowledge that named the danger and learned to manage it. The story is not a neat moral lesson. It is an account of how chemistry enters life, makes demands, and forces society to change or pay. Like phosphorus taught that in a stark way. It burned into the world, left traces on faces on fields in law books, in the air over industrial towns that took years to clear. Meanwhile, it made light so cheap households shrugged. It took a long time for people and governments to see the true price. The story of taking is also a story of reckoning. An alchemist's curiosity became furnaces and dusted vats, mines and matches. An economy that valued a bright thing too highly for too long. Medical pages, reformers' pamphlets, slow meetings of lawmakers eventually nudged the system towards safer ground. But the road to safety was paved with industrial waste, bones of a food system burned for chemistry, slag heaps and phosphogypsum piles, voices of factory girls in radical newspapers. Phosphorus moved from a glow in a Hamburg bottle to a commodity that changed agricultural kitchens across Europe and left a mark on the bodies of those who made modern life. It did so because it was useful, and because for an age the math of cost was wrong. They walked out in a way that made the city notice. Not a loud march with banners, but a steady stream of girls in plain dresses. They simply stopped making matches and stepped into the sun. It was July 1888, at the Bryant and May factory in London's East End. About 1,400 workers, most young women and children, left the doors. They came to work with chalk in pockets, hands stained with paste. They went home with dry mouths, small wages, and sometimes a jaw rotting in a private nightmare. The walkout was not sudden in their minds. It was 1,000 small humiliations adding up. Fines, petty punishments, wage books that felt like threats. A single public breaking point. When it happened, it felt like a bell ringing underwater, muffled, unstoppable, drawing attention from beyond the slums. The match trade had a smell sulf, the glue a metallic tang. The product was a tiny architecture of chemistry, heads of white phosphorus mixed with other chemicals, dipped, dried, sorted by hands moving with mechanical grace. White phosphorus is sneaky. It glows faintly in the dark. In industry it was practical, it ignited easily when struck. That convenience came with a slow cruelty. Workers who mixed and coated the heads were not just working with fire. They worked with a poison that over months and years could eat bone from inside. The medical name Phosphorus gives clinical distance, but the mouths that suffered were places of shame. Match girls covered their mouths rather than complain. The disease became a hidden emblem of indifference. The grounds for the strike were practical. Workers were paid by the piece and punished by the fine. A girl who dropped a match was fined. If she spoke up, she might be fined for insubordination. Children started at 6 a.m. worked until dusk in dusty room. Managers inspected pockets and moods. Bryant and May was both maker and disciplinarian. The system of fines was more crushing than the labor. The match girls knew they were replaceable. They also knew this clever, precise industry was obscene in its accounting. When profit came before bones, the spark was small. A few girls fired a threat of a fine for rumored theft. The company's attempt to bully workers seeking tiny redress. But small provocations matter when you have nothing else. There were organizers among them, girls with more nerve than fear. Sarah Chapman's name appears in records, a steady hand. She helped the strikers organize and stay strong. They did not have a union at first except in spirit. They learned to call meetings, choose speakers, make demands on pavements. Their most unlikely ally was Annie Besant, a journalist and agitator. She found in the match girls a perfect cause. She wrote, published, organized meeting. She brought the strikers into the glare of a city that liked neat candles. Her articles did not just describe misery, they pressed it into daily life. The image of a jaw dissolving from inside was hard to ignore. So newspapers, clubs, members of parliament began to ask questions. The Match Girls campaign had a strategic logic. They did not just tell their pain, they planned how the story would reach people. Journalists who loved scandal, religious groups who loved moral fixes, social reformers starting to see industrial harm as policy, not pity. The strikers knew the economy is a theatre of reputations. A company that seemed heartless could be bullied by the market and voters. They wrote petitions, staged meetings in union halls, church basements. They went to the press. They picked their narratives with a political instinct. There is a cunning in using shame as a tool. The factory lives on customers who do not see the process. Publicity made the hidden visible, a strategy of sunlight and legal notice. Bryant and May first flinched, then dug in. They denied, said the girls exaggerated, offered small goodwill gestures. But public opinion, once activated by reporting, was not easily calmed. The strike drew trade unionists, socialists, middle-class reformers. An uneasy coalition. Speakers sometimes misunderstood the workers, but pressure built. Politicians who saw regulation as a theoretical problem now answered a simple question. If an industry makes workers sick, whose job is it to stop it? The answer in public talk shifted from employer conscience to state duty. A small intellectual revolution before the legal machinery moved. Within weeks, Bryant and May gave in on many demands. Under the watchful press, they reinstated workers, adjusted fines, eased some of the worst humiliations. The victory was narrow, practical, and deeply important. The girls formed the Union of Women Matchmakers, a modest union in size but huge in signal. Their strike did not end Psychiatry overnight or remake industrial chemistry, but it did something more pivotal. It put worker safety on the public ledger. It proved poor women in slums could organize and win against a rich foe. For labor history and women's activism, this is not small. The Match Girls strike entered the playbook for later suffragette unions, used the press, expose visible symptoms of industrial callousness, forced the state and market to reckon with moral cost. If the strike was the human register of the problem, the technical fix had been waiting in Scandinavia for decades. The safety match, the idea to move dangerous phosphorus off the match, was not a sudden epiphany in 1888, but a mid-century rearrangement. Swedish chemist Gustav Fredrik Pask proposed in the 1842. Put the phosphorus on a separate striking surface. Keep the toxic stuff off the parts workers handle in bulk. Cut the main pathways for poisoning. The idea needed refinement and industrial engineering. Pask had the notion. The Lundstrom brothers turned it into mass production. By the 1852 and 1860s, Jönköping became a factory town. Safety matches rolled off machines. The Swedish industry organized not just to make a safer product, but to find markets that valued safety over immediate cheapness. They called them Swedish matches and exported across Europe. The label was both brand and moral claim. The chemistry is simple and decisive. White phosphorus is fatally reactive. It oxidizes easily and is absorbed. Red phosphorus is more stable. It does not hunger for oxygen as much. It is far less likely to go through skin. But red phosphorus on the striking strip used safer oxidizers in the heads. The most dangerous substance is never in the match head in large amounts. Making them still needed care. Accidents could happen. But the path that ate the matchmaker's jaw was cut. Industry could not unlearn the profit drive. So adoption was always about incentive as much as smarts. Some firms resisted. Some said safety matches were less reliable or more expensive. Others worried about the cost of retooling whole production lines. There was friction in the market and lobbying in government halls. Here the story leaves the shop floor for treaties and politics. The Berne Convention of 1906 was an early 20th century answer in international law to a problem born of industrial chemistry and human smallness. Delegates met in Switzerland to negotiate a technical ban. To activists, it was a prohibition against slow legalized murder. The convention asked governments to ban making matches with white phosphorus. It did not end every match head at once. International deals need national ratification and enforcement, but it served as a moral and diplomatic lever. Governments began to legislate. Where labor politics were responsive, bans came soon. Where corporate interest was stronger, change was slower. But the pattern was set. A technology tolerated for cheapness and convenience, was now seen as intolerable. The international community agreed imperfectly but formally. Some costs were too high to be mere business incidents. Market logic worked with law. Consumers began to prefer safer matches. Safety matches appealed to middle-class ideas of cleanliness, and to merchants who understood reputation. Swedish match factories experienced in large-scale production captured markets, not by charity, but by product quality and an integrated export model. British firms chastened by scandal adapted in various ways. Some retooled, some delayed, some rebranded. The United States followed a different path. American makers had invested heavily in strike-anywhere matches. Their transition was paced by different commerce and litigation. In every country, technology, law and market preference set the speed of change. The Berne Convention gave international cover for national reforms. The press and public opinion gave domestic heat. Together they created a self-reinforcing cycle. Scandal brought regulation. Regulation created liability. Liability created incentives to adopt safer tech. A long, unromantic, effective legal and economic dance. Even then, chemistry kept inventing around law. The twin wants for convenience and safety inspired new alternatives, like phosphorus, sesquisulfide and safer oxidizer blends. Later innovations allowed strike-anywhere quality with much lower toxicity. A small irony: consumers ask for convenience, then are surprised by the cost. The match story moves from the worker's body to the patent office and back, as if the element insisted on being central to human life in many ways. The arc from jaw to field is perhaps the most instructive term. Once white phosphorus in matches was under public scrutiny, and red phosphorus was established as a safer way to make flame. Phosphorus did not lose its hold on modernity. It just moved from the factory to the farm. Chemists in the 1800s, notably Justus von Liebig, argued plants need mineral nutrients. Liebig reframed agriculture from habitant folk wisdom into a chemical problem. Soils are reservoirs of nutrients that crops drain. They need replenishment with precise compounds. Phosphorus as part of bone, seed and living tissue was key. It is not a metaphor. Phosphorus is a maker of bones. Skeletons, teeth, biochemistry all need it. The agricultural logic was simple and ruthless. Give phosphorus back to soil in a form plants can absorb. Raise yields, reduce need for careful manure management. The chemistry to do this existed by the 1840s. The first big commercial step was to take insoluble rock phosphate and turn it into soluble superphosphate. Treat phosphate rock with sulfuric acid. This liberates soluble phosphates. John Bennett Laws and his partner, Joseph Henry Gilbert, Rothamsted, England, perfected and commercialized this in the 1840s. Laws patented a version and set up a factory, creating a bridge from lab chemistry to a supply chain for fertilizer at scale. The product was simple to explain to farmers and profound in effect. A field with superphosphate produces more fodder, more grain, predictably. Rotational farming needed to keep soil fertility could be changed. The implication was enormous. With enough mineral fertilizer, you could support bigger populations than local manure cycles allowed. There was an intervening phase important for logistics and geopolitics. Before industrial superphosphate, there was guano. The guano boom of the mid-1800s. Peruvian islands covered in fossilized seabed droppings fed European fields. It inflamed imperial policy. The U.S. Guano Islands Act of 1856 was a clear political move to secure these deposits. Guano figured in wars and treaties, created market shocks in fertilizer supply. Guano was for a while the premium phosphate, was concentrated and convenient. But deposits are finite. The Guano Islands were exhausted in a few decades. The exhaustion was not just geological, it was a logistics problem. How to move millions of tons of rock. How to acidify it at scale, ship it to hungry farm. How to secure supplies under foreign flags or in colonial territories. That political dimension is where the story goes global. Phosphate rock is a mineral resource unevenly spread. As farmers used superphosphate demand for rock rose markets move. Mines in the southeastern U.S. South Carolina, Florida, Espone Valley ramped up production in the late 1800s. In the Pacific, small islands like Nauru and Bonobo Ocean Island suddenly had huge value. Ancient bird life and coral uplift created surface deposits. European powers and later colonial administrations saw these islands as strategic. Railways, piers, processing plants rose where village gardens once were. The physical logistics were straightforward in outline but immense. Heavy rock to be quarried, ground, treated with acid, granulated, bagged, shipped. Ports expanded, rail networks grew into ignored hinterland. Industrial agriculture did not just transform fields. It created whole infrastructures of extraction and transport. The scale by the early 1900s created its own controversies. Local environments were stripped of topsoil and vegetation. Island ecologies became moonscapes. Indigenous communities on Bonobo and Nauru were displaced for fertilizer. An irony, the same element used to make bread was mined at great cost to local lives. Colonial deals and uneven legal bargains let extraction proceed with little payback. The British Phosphate Commissioners controlled Pacific mining interests. They negotiated terms good for the imperial balance sheet, not for islanders. Nauru's story, sudden wealth and degradation and despair. Phosphate rents built a rich government, then the rock thinned. Investments were squandered, litigation followed. An island nation left with more debts than land. A cautionary tale about resource wealth and fragile institutions. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the market changed. Globalization meant a mine in Morocco could set the price for an Iowa corn farmer. Corporations consolidated. In the U.S., the phosphate business wound through companies until in 2004, the Mosaic Company emerged from a merger. A single firm with big operations in Florida, Idaho, and exports to Brazil. Across the Atlantic, Russia's Phosagro and Norway's came to dominate trade. But the corporate charts hid a basic fact. A relatively small set of mines, many state-owned, many in fragile places, supplied a material without which modern harvests would fall. This concentration invited politics. In 2008, commodity prices surged, the fertilizer market tightened. Governments worried about food security. Some, like China, imposed export limits to keep domestic supplies. Those restrictions spiked prices and kept policymakers awake. The spike spurred an intellectual panic, the debate over peak phosphorus. In 2009, researchers like David Cordell published analyses. They showed proven reserves were much more concentrated than people thought. Estimates were sensitive to price, technology, and reporting by exporting countries. Headlines multiplied, diplomatic cables circled the same fact. Control of phosphate was control of a basic line of food security. Whether peak came in a specific year mattered less than the strategic posture. Stockpiles, export controls, vertical integration, sometimes nationalization. Governments were willing to adopt these postures. They created strange partnerships. Agribusiness conglomerates, trading houses, national development banks. Sometimes on the same side of talks with exporting states. Other times their interests split from local communities near the pits. In Jordan, phosphate mining brought economic weight but also social strain. The Jordan Phosphate Mines Company, a national champion, exported heavily. Mining towns complained of unemployment, pollution, and that their labor paid for faraway cities. In Tunisia, the mining basin around Ga Fes supplied phosphate for decades. Grievances over jobs and wealth distribution exploded in strikes and protests in 2008. Those struggles, suppressed but remembered, fed into the larger Arab Spring convulsions. In Western Sahara, a mining the Bussi are or under Moroccan control raised legal and moral questions. Who owns the wealth of the contested territory? Courts and the UN asked if export deals could continue without the Sahrawi people's consent. The answers were partial. The deals went on the conveyor belt on the sand, kept moving. Scale is hard to visualize. A single modern phosphoric acid plant eats thousands of tons of rock a day. A single freighter can carry tens of thousands of tons to a distant fertilizer complex. The logistics of ports, rail gauges, sulfuric acid supply chains become statecraft. In Florida, Bone Valley mines spurred rail traffic to Tempe, the Bay, and the biports. In Morocco, dedicated lines and deep-water terminals for phosphate became national infrastructure. Export revenues underwrote public budgets and foreign policy. It was never just an economic game of supply and demand. It was a contest connecting a truck driver in Florida, a minister in Robert, a tractor driver in Punjab, all linked by a single chemical need and the political choices controlling the sort. That same elemental intimacy appears on the battlefield where phosphorus took a darker life. White phosphorus is not just fertilizer raw material. It is a chemical that burns fiercely in air, produces dense clinging smoke and hard to extinguish fire. Militaries learned long ago to use this chemistry. In the trenches of World War I and the artillery of World War II, shells and grenades fill the air with smoke, not of soot but oxidized phosphorus. A quick bright fog to hide troops marked targets, or set thatch roofs alight. Arm is valued at speed. A shell bursts, the air becomes a white curtain. Soldiers knew the smell, acrid sharp, like the inside of a battery. If phosphorus touched flesh, it was unforgettable. Manuals describe it clinically. White phosphorus stored underwater, because exposed to air it molders and ignites. When dispersed by detonation, it forms small burning particles. They keep oxidizing and make dense phosphorus pentex. The pentex grabs moisture and turns into sticky, corrosive acids. Militaries love that combo: deployable smoke for concealment and incendiary effect. In practice, the effects were morally messy. The same compound that hid tanks also burns, sometimes continuously, on human skin. Burning particles embed in tissue, resisting simple removal. 20th century medical literature is full of the horror of phosphorus burns. Necrotic wounds that glowed faintly needed amputation, long painful recovery. Major wars hardened doctrine around such munitions. White phosphorus was put into artillery, mortar, and air-dropped bombs. Nothing else quite matched its mix of illumination, obscuration, and incendiary power. U.S. Army grenade catalogs, British handbooks, Soviet manuals all had entries for WP round. It was used for smoke screens and as an anti-personnel and anti-material tool. In Korea, Vietnam, and later urban conflicts, its use resurfaced legal and ethical question, whereas the line between a legitimate smoke screen and an incendiary weapon in a populated area. That question, answered differently by lawyers, soldiers, and humanitarians, is never fully settled. International humanitarian law bans indiscriminate attacks, requires precautions to avoid civilian harm. The 1980 Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons tightened rules on incendiary weapons. It restricted air-dropped incendiaries and use against civilian concentration. But definitions of partial white phosphorus falls into a legal and moral gray zone. State practice is inconsistent. Some militaries limit WP use in populated areas, others treat it as ordinary munition. The incendiary effects are called incidental to legitimate military aim. Controversies have real weight. Allegations of WP use in Lebanon, Gaza, Iraq, Fallujah prompted investigations by Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the Red Cross. They catalog instances, interview survivors, challenge official narratives that say it was only for smoke. Military spokespeople give the technical defense. WP is not a chemical weapon. Its use when properly targeted is lawful. Medics and rights investigators counter with forensic detail. They emphasize the indistinguishable effect and predictable human suffering when it lands among houses. Late-night debates among jurists, nitpicky and fierce echo an old quiet fact. Phosphorus, the same stubborn atom that makes bones and fields, is indifferent to neat legal category. It burns. The battlefield story melts into the industrial one when we measure the broader human cost. The same modern processes that strip and refine rock create vast waste. Phosphogypsum, the pale powdery left over from making phosphoric acid, collects in engineered stacks the size of small lakes. They smell faintly of sulfur, machines moving them coated in fine white powder. The stacks are a global phenomenon, but American and Moroccan examples are huge. Phosphogypsum contains traces of uranium, radium fluorides, heavy metals like cadmium. For decades, regulators and scientists have argued about safe uses. Does low-grade radioactivity make the piles permanently unusable? What is the risk to groundwater? In the US, the EPA set strict limits on agricultural reuse of phosphogypsum. So much of it stays piled. Incidents involving stack collapses or leaks are environmental horror stories. One recent chapter came in April 2021 in Manatee County, Florida, at Piney Point. A leaky dam around millions of gallons of wastewater threatened to fail. Large-scale evacuations as engineers discharged acidic brine into the environment to avert a flood. Tracked as black plastic emergency light on a sickly pond. The public face of an industry with long-term liabilities. Nearby reclaimed phosphate pits dot the landscape. Elsewhere, in Florida, regions show checkerboards of mined-out basins and replanted grove. Environmental equations are complicated by geology. Florida's porous aquifers are leaky contaminants moving seen. Further from the stacks, phosphorus shows in water in another more diffuse, devastating form. Nutrient runoff from fields where phosphate fertilizer is applied, sometimes too heavily, drains into rivers and eventually into lakes, where fresh water meets nutrients. Algae bloom. The results are green carpet along shores, beautiful from a distance. Vivid slick turquoise or pea soup green. Up close they stink and are cruelly efficient at killing life. Lake Erie's western basin, repeatedly choked by summer bloom. David dramatic show in 2014. The city of Toledo, Ohio warned hundreds of thousands not to drink tap water due to microcepent contamination from algae. The Great Lakes' sudden bitter reminder was mirrored elsewhere. The Baltic Sea's dead zones, Chesapeake Bay's perennial struggles. The enormous yearly Gulf of Mexico, dead zone the size of a small country, fed by the Mississippi River's tributaries and the farms upstream. There is human scale and other ways too. In late 1800s, London match factories' white phosphorus caused a disease with an ugly name, Phos Cyjor. Workers, mostly women and girls making matches, inhaled or absorbed white phosphorus. The result was necrosis of the jawbone, painful, disfiguring, sometimes fatal. The match girls' strike of 1888, the protests, investigations by reformers like Annie Besant. The slow recognition industry had a social cost. An old lesson about the human price of convenience. The scandal was not just British. Similar afflictions appeared across Europe and America, until regulations on red phosphorus largely ended white phosphorus matches. Chronic toxicologies around mining, fluoride poisoning, lung disease from dust. Heavy metals and drinking water have followed communities worldwide. In Morocco, phosphate towns are wealthy by regional standards, but live with dust and plant smells. Indonesia, the Gafsa Basin's history is of extraction and underinvestment in local infrastructure. On Pacific Islands, the social devastation was stark. Land that once supported dense populations under guano-rich soils became, after decades of mining, almost uninhabitable. Traditional livelihoods gone, customary landowners left to litigate against gone colonial states. When islanders return to claim restitution, the paradox is cruel. Phosphorus feeds crops and secures harvests, but its extraction, refinement, and misuse undermine other ecological services. Water quality, soil health, public trust. Often benefits work captured far from harms. Large fertilizer corporations and distant agricultural exporters took profits. Local communities absorbed the costs, breathing dust, watching fish die, dealing with contaminated water and hollowed hills. Today, policy debates are as practical as they are ethical. how to secure supply without creating dependency, how to balance the short-term need to keep fertilizer flowing with the long-term need to restore mined landscapes, limit runoff, protect workers. Some answers are technical and soft. Improve phosphorus use efficiency with precision agriculture. Time applications to reduce runoff. Use sedge field filters and constructed wetlands to trap nutrients before they enter rivers. Other answers are systemic and stubborn. Recycle phosphorus in human waste. Recover struvite from wastewater treatment plants. Redesign food systems to reduce waste so less fertilizer is needed per calorie. Researchers like David Cordell, alarmed by reserve concentration, advocated stewardship. A turn from extraction to circularly, urging nations to treat phosphorus like a strategic metal. There are examples halting and hopeful. Cities in Europe and North America pilot phosphorus recovery from sewage. Farmers in parts of Western Europe use manure and compost more systematically. Companies in Morocco invest in community programs and new tech, trying to show a state-owned firm can be a development engine as well as an exporter. Yet the default story remains the one that plays out with extractive resources. Profits and political power concentrate. The environmental bill is left to the local in the future. In the end, the element stays stubbornly characteristic of the human condition. Small in any single plant, essential in aggregate, politically loaded wherever found. The geopolitics of phosphate tell us a resource map is also an atlas of vulnerability. Battlefield users remind us chemistry does not wear armor, it just behaves. Toxic legacies on landscapes and in lakes are long shadows of a civilization that learned to coax harvests from earth, but has been less good at living with the consequences of that power. We wake each morning fed by unglamorous rock that governments counted, carted and fought over. Then we live with its consequences. The algae come on a lake, the scab of a phosphogypsum stack on a plain. The faint sulfur smell where a processing plant once stood. Solutions are not purely technological, they are regulatory. Stronger environmental safeguards on the renegotiation of benefits for host communities. The real cost of cleanup priced into the market. And the civic, global treaties and local participatory governance that do not treat phosphate as something just to be taken, but as a public good to be shared and stewarded. History holds a lesson slow and slippery, as a river scarcity makes politics. But the converse is also true. How we govern abundance shapes scarcity. If a few countries control most accessible rock, then diplomatic stability and trade transparency become as vital as the best fertilizer formula. If militaries keep carrying white phosphorus without clear enforceable rules for use near civilians, legal subtleties will not spare the injured. If companies and states keep treating phosphogypsum stacks as temporary problems, the next generation will pay. There is a peculiar comfort. We have the knowledge to do better. We can measure dead zones, trace phosphate footprints through trade stats, design bricks from recovered phosphogypsum, recover struvite and press it back into plant nutrition. Reconfigure subsidies so inefficiency is not rewarded. Demand transparency from companies whose docks load the bulk carriers that feed the world. We can treat phosphorus as the strategic finite resource it is. Stop pretending the ground will always replenish itself for free. The long story folds gently on itself. Mines and markets, militaries and medicine, harvests and headaches. The devil's element that once rotted jaws in smoky factories now underwrites supper tables, clouds over harvests, fuels international arguments in meeting room, where diplomats talk cautiously about export quotas and food security. The tale is not a morality play with a neat end. It is a long ledger with columns of profit and ruin and occasional lines of repair. For anyone who has planted a seed or stirred a pot of vegetables, there is a quiet obligation to remember. The white dust that makes green things grow came at a price. To sleep now, one might hope waking decisions, regulation, reclamation, recycling, will be taken with the same relentless care that centuries ago turned bone and guano into civilization. The world will still need phosphate tomorrow. How we choose to get it and clean up afterward is a story that will be written in politics as much as in chemistry. Phosphorus is the quiet scaffolding of life, the invisible hinge on which 1,000 small exchanges of energy and information swing. It is the phosphate group that binds to deoxyribonucleic, forms the long sugar phosphate backbone of DNA, a delicate rope along which the genetic script is read and copied. James Watson and Francis Crick in 1953 showed the double helix, made the phosphate backbone obvious to every biology student. But the element itself had been doing the works since life began. It is adenosine triphosphate, ATP, the little coin with 3 phosphate atoms, the chemical currency whose centrality was argued by Fritz Lippmann in 1941. He and Hans Krebs were later honored for mapping metabolism into cycles and curves. Carl Lohmann first isolated those phosphorylated nucleotides into our years, long before Watson and Crick's model. Emil Fischer's legacy and steady enzyme mapping made it clear. Phosphorylation was not just attaching the chemical tag, but a switch, a dimmer, a regulator of life's machinery. In 1992, Edmund Fischer and Edwin Krebs got the Nobel Prize for making that point formal. Reversible protein phosphorylation is how cells turn things on and off, how muscles answer commands, hormones modify fate. The chemistry is elegant and intimate. Phosphate groups' negative charges make membranes hold together, make DNA strands repel, give it a backbone that will not collapse, make ATP a molecule that can hand off energy with a click. Put your cheek to a microscope, imagine the slick phospholipidive tiles of a cell membrane. You can almost feel the thin oily resistance of phosphatid and Michelin's molecules. Hydrophilic heads balanced like small moons over hydrophobic tails. Those phospholipids were first proposed as part of the membrane in the 1920s. Gaucher and Grend, a Les paper in 1925 at Leiden University, was an early step to the modern picture. On a different bench, farmers in the 1800s felt phosphorus as a shortage. Bones burnt to ash were a rich, earthy smell, a cheap mineral source. Bone meal was the slow, honest fertilizer of old fields. John Bennett Laws of Rothamsted patented methods in the 1840s to make phosphate more soluble, more immediately useful to plants. Superpestite was born of sulfuric acids, tang meeting bone or rock. Logistics of feeding a growing world nudged chemists into action. Chemistry met industry and scaled. The 1800s hunger for fertilizer had a cousin in a more exotic commodity, guano. Ships, flags and debts traced seaward droppings across the Pacific and Atlantic in the mid-1800s. The United States passed the Guano Islands Act in 1856. Britain, France, Germany negotiated access rental payments, messy confrontations over islands, where nitrogen and phosphorus lay in dry heaps. When guano supplies strained, mining turned to phosphate rock on land. The story of phosphate's entry into global industry moves like a map of empires. Florida's Bone Valley, the phosphate belt of North Carolina deposits in North Africa, especially those making Morocco and Westerns, a era central in the 20th and 21st centuries. In the quiet archive, one can trace how fertilizers empires and steam-driven shipping conspired to change soils half a world away. There is a merciless irony in the chemical versatility of the element. The same phosphorus that cradles the energy of every heartbeat also underwrites a huge famine of human-made molecules, used to control pests and, in darker seasons, to kill people. In the labs of IG Farben in Germany, in the 1930s, a chemist named Gerhard Schrader tinkered. He sought new ways to protect crops when he stumbled upon organophosphate compounds of terrible potency. Tabun was first synthesized in 1936 and followed in 1938. Seman and other G-series nerve agents emerged after. Schrader looked for insecticides because industry paid for that. He found weapons because chemistry, when scaled and retooled by state priorities, does not ask for manners. The German military quickly saw the significance. Not the first time industrial chemistry slouched into war, but one of the most unnerving. A single phosphorus atom arranged with carbon, oxygen, fluorine in the right configuration can lock the tiny enzyme acetylcholine, bring the nervous system's graceful choreography to a shuddering halt. This biochemical fact, organophosates covalently bind to and inhibit acetylcholine, is the dark mirror of life's phosphorus chemistry. Acetylcholine should finish neurotransmission, clearing acetylcholine from synapses so muscles can relax, nerves can reset. When that clearing fails, air leaves lungs, muscles cease. Physiology is simple calculus, straightforward chemistry, not mysterious consequences are. In the small towns and large war factories of the 20th century, that calculus made tools for agriculture and tragedies for workers and civilians. After World War I, organophosphate insecticides spread into fields worldwide. They were effective, fast, cheap, replaced or supplemented DDT in many places. DDT's persistence and bioaccumulation were criticized in books like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring 1962. The environmental movement pushed for newer compounds, seeming to promise less long-term residue, yet less persistent did not mean safe. Acute poisonings and chronic exposures mounted scale matters. Production lines were not boutique operations. Massive chemical plants in Germany, France, the US before the war. More factories in the Soviet Union, later India and China, as agricultural intensification demanded inputs. Organophosphate pesticides like Parathion, Malathion or Parufian, names that crept into farmers' lexicon, were made by the ton. Sex cross-borders reached smallholders and corporate farms alike. The distribution network did what good markets do, matched supply and demand. The human cost poisoning's chronic load, ounces to children's developing brains, came in numbers and stories. Epidemiologists in the late 20th and early 21st centuries documented patterns. Prenatal exposures in agricultural valleys in California and elsewhere. Work of investigators like Brenda Askey and Ozian colleagues in the 1990 seconds and 2000 seconds recorded links between organophosphate exposure and neurodevelopmental outcomes in children. Clinical picture and public health statistics converged. Organophosphates chemistry had an express lane into bodies. Consequences were not evenly distributed, nor were weapons confined to labs. Discovery of tabun and sarin in the 1930 seconds had military implications unfolding over decades. Cold War arsenals clandestine in testing, regrettably employment in conflict by non-state actors. A UN Shinrikyo-SR, an attack on the Tokyo subway in 1995 shocked Japan and the world. The slowness with which the group sought and deployed such a compound underscored the terrifying democratization of a certain menace. In the 1990 seconds and 2000 seconds, the world moved toward agreements and institutions to snuff out misuse. The Geneva Protocol of 1925 was an early imperfect attempt to ban chemical weapon use. The Chemical Weapons Convention, negotiated in 1993, entering force in 1997, under the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, set more comprehensive prohibitions, an enforcement mechanism. Governments agreed finally manufacture, storage, use of such agents would be illegal. Stockpiles would be declared and destroyed. The technical detail of phosphorus chemistry did not vanish, it was placed inside a legal and moral frame. We learn it to make rules, we still contend with enforcement. The other side of the ledger, phosphorus, as fertilizer, a fundamental nutrient, has its own logics of production and scarcity. Phosphate rock is a finite geological resource. High-grade deposits are concentrated in a few places. Morocco and the contested sands of Western Sahara hold an outsized share of known reserves. The Boussiraa mine near LAA Uni became geopolitically significant after Spain's withdrawal. Morocco's 1975 Green March, because phosphorus in the ground translates into leverage in trade and agriculture. China, the US, Russia, Jordan, Brazil, others have important deposits too. But an evidence of reserves combined with shipping logistics and fertilizer geopolitics always made phosphorus more than a simple commodity. In 2008, a sharp spike in fertilizer prices driven by energy costs, commodity speculation, demand from expanding biofuel crops, other factors, made food security committees set up and calculate vulnerability. Economists and resource scientists asked bluntly, what if we run into limits? The phrase peak phosphorus began circulating among scholars like David Cordell and colleagues. Their work in the 2000s made a public argument for thinking of phosphorus as a resource to be safeguarded, reused, conserved. This is where the second act, the story of phosphorus recycling, moves from margins into policy and industry. Wastewater, after all, is a concentrated portrait of what a city eats. Human urine, feces, kitchen scraps, animal manure carry back much phosphorus poured into fields and foods. Sewage sludge, the semi-solid residue from wastewater plants, is rich in phosphorus, historically spread on fields as a cheap soil amendment, but also a repository for heavy metals, industrial contaminants, more recently persistent organic pollutants, and PFAS, made many governments uneasy about unrestricted reuse. Still, engineers and entrepreneurs saw opportunity in what utilities long treated as a nuisance. Struvite, magnesium ammonium phosphate, would form in pipes as scaling mineral fouling pumps and clarifiers. That same quality could be harnessed if managers control pH and added magnesium. Crystals could be harvested, sold as a slow-release fertilizer. Companies and municipal utilities discovered virtue, turning a clog into a commodity. Practical solutions proliferated, multiplied in variety. Technologies range from relatively simple to grandly industrial. Precipitation of struvite at the clarifier outfall is a straightforward engineering retrofit. Enhanced biological phosphorus removal (EBP) are developed and refined since the 1970s. Uses alternating anaerobic and aerobic zones and activated sludge systems to encourage microbes to sequester phosphorus. Incineration of sewage sludge concentrates phosphorus into ash. That ash can be treated with acid leaching or thermal processes to yield a phosphorus residue converted into fertilizer precursors. Thermal gasification, pyrolysis, hydrothermal liquefaction promise energetically integrated pathways, turning organic waste into energy, retaining or concentrating mineral fractions. Source separation, building urinals and toilets that collect urine separately, is a low-tech, profound option. Urine accounts for a disproportionate fraction of phosphorus and nitrogen in household wastewater. When collected, it can be sanitized, used to fertilize nearby field. Each method carries trade-offs. Capital costs energy, needs the specter of contaminants. What farmers will accept as legitimate substitutes for mined phosphate. Policy and markets can nudge those trade-offs. Europe has been particularly active here. The EU placed phosphate rock on its list of critical raw materials, updated regulations to allow certain categories of recycled phosphorus in fertilizers under safety criteria. The regulation on fertilizing products, revised in recent years, created pathways for byproducts and recovered materials to enter the market if they meet contaminant thresholds. National initiatives complemented supranational rules. Switzerland, with acute concern for lake water quality, moved early to require phosphorus removal in many wastewater plants, explore ash-based recycling pathways. Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden have pilots and full-scale installations where struvite recovery and ash processing feed local agriculture or are sold as branded recycled fertilizers. In the U.S., municipalities and some utilities, under pressure to manage costs and maintain infrastructure, have experimented with recovery technologies, commercial partnerships, turning a disposal problem into a revenue stream. The social dimension is as large as the technical. Consider the Netherlands, soil thick with history and nitrogen and phosphorus from decades of dense livestock farming. Manure mountains, literal and regulatory, forced the Dutch state and farmer cooperatives to rethink logistics. Where can surplus phosphorus go when borders on nitrogen and phosphorus carry environmental consequences? The answer was not just to ship slurry across the channel, but to invest in processing convert liquid waste to concentrated fertilizers. Export processed products reframe manure from waste into resource. That cultural and logistical shift is what a sustainable phosphorus economy demands. Different infrastructure, different markets, different pricing reflecting environmental costs. What might those pricing signals look like? Governments can subsidize recovery as they long subsidized extraction through tax structures, infrastructure support, or levy fees on virgin phosphate extraction reflecting externalities, making recycled phosphorus competitive. Labels and certification. A recycled phosphorus mark could establish demand premium for recovered products. Standards matter to farmers. Need to trust fertilizer in a bag acts predictably, does not carry heavy metals or persistent organic pollutants into their soils. The European Commission, industry groups, civil society platforms, like the European Sustainable Phosphorus Platform, the Sustainable Phosphorus Alliance, work to create technical norms, life cycle assessments, market languages, smoothing the path from waste stream to fertilizer bag. Yet technical possibility and regulatory allowance do not automatically produce deployment at scale. There are stubborn obstacles. Recycled phosphorus sometimes costs more than rock quarried in Morocco or a small mine. Smallholder farmers in low-income countries need cheap, reliable nutrients for next season's cereals. Utilities must weigh capital budgets against operating savings. Political attention is fickle. The answer lies in a range of policies. Public procurement rules favoring recycled nutrient, research funding for low-cost recovery in the developing world, extension services teaching farmers to use slow-release locally produced fertilizers, international cooperation to prevent single points of failure in supply chains. The green revolution of the 20th century taught a lesson about scale and speed. A second revolution, slower, more circular, will require patience, money, governance at multiple scales. It will also require broader humility about toxicity and worker safety. History painfully taught. The 19th century match factories are a clear, intimate parable. White phosphorus that lumined as soily allotrope was cheap, convenient, made matches that lit the dark with a satisfying hiss. It also caused foresight on necrosis of bone, ravaging factory workers' mouths, causing chronic pain, slow death. The match girls' strike at Bryant and May in London 1880, aided by activists like Annie Besant, drew public attention to conditions pressure on industry and governments mounted. Internationally, the fight culminated in a ban on white phosphorus in match manufacturing. In the first years of the 20th century, the Berne Convention, 1906, and host of national laws thereafter, safety-alarmed industrial invention reshaped the industry. Red phosphorus safety matches, safer manufacturing, replaced greasy luciferase. It took law, agitation, science to align, so an industrial convenience would not be paid for with human jaws. Modern parallels are blunt. Workers in fertilizer plants, pesticide factories, fields where spraying is common, need protections early industrial law did not provide. The US created OSHA in 1970, renewed attention to chemical safety. The EU adopted REACE, ancient regulation in 2006 stringent program for registration and control of chemical substances. Chemical weapons regulated by the Chemical Weapons Convention from the 1992 onward, policed by the OPCW. Pesticides subject to progressively stricter testing, some outright bans. Sri Lanka's experience, late 20th century, record high suicide rates, linked in part to accessible highly toxic pesticides, produced a social and regulatory reaction. Bans on certain compounds followed in some studies by measurable declines in suicide mortality. A hard lesson in how governance can save lives while constraining markets. A final larger lesson about how a single element can shape geopolitics, economies, health. Phosphorus has been alchemy and revelation, a source of wealth and cause of ruin, central to industrial expansion and feeding billions. Through the 20th century's massive mobilization of fertilizers with Haber-Bosch nitrogen fixation, also the access of terrible chemistry from early matchmakers to mid-century nerve agents, to the small internet poisoning through a field worker's broken gloves. The government's challenge for the 21st century is to hold all these strands in one hand, secure supplies for food security, reduce environmental leakage into lakes and oceans, protect workers and communities from toxic exposures, prevent diversion of knowledge and material into instruments of harm. Practically, that requires a mix of regulatory measures and cultural shifts. Calls for mandatory reporting and monitoring of phosphorus flows at national and watershed scales, so no Ministry of Agriculture, Environment, Health, Industry can plead ignorance. Asks subsidies be restructured so they do not encourage wasteful over-application of fertilizer. Asks support for smallholders who might otherwise be harmed by higher input prices. Asks companies to redesign supply chains, create partnerships between utilities, agribusinesses, so struvite and derived fertilizers have guaranteed buyers. Asks international cooperation to reduce geopolitical choke points. Diversification of supplies, stockpiling policies for critical agricultural input. Crucially, support for technologies cheap, robust, deployable in low-income settings, where recycling can be decentralized, not centralized. There is also a moral dimension. The 19th century match forced a reckoning about the value of a human life against factory profits. Today's reckoning must broaden that logic. The price of a ton of phosphate rock must somehow reflect the cost of turning a river into an algal carpet, the cost of a child's lost learning to prenatal exposure, the invisible toll when aquifers are salinized, soils degraded. Not a call for sentimental accounting, but for real policy making. Taxes that internalize externalities, incentives that reward circularly. Safety regulators as vigilant about chronic exposures as catastrophic events. In quieter rooms of laboratories and municipal utilities, people are already doing this work in ways that, if patient and persistent, will matter. Engineers in the Netherlands and Germany retrofitting wastewater plants. Entrepreneurs from Vancouver to Belgium finding markets for recovered phosphorus products. Universities in Australia, the UK, the US developing roadmaps, national strategies, treating phosphorus as a resource to be stored dead. International bodies from UN Environment Programme to regional commissions, convening scientists and ministers. The technologies are imperfect, cultures slow to change, some policies misjudged, but the possibility of a circular phosphorus economy is real. As the restless century rolls forward, the lesson is not merely technical. It is ethical, logistical, political. We must govern the devil's element with care, remembering the match girls, the chemists in Antwerp, Germany, the farmers on plain and hill, the children in polluted watersheds, and do the unglamorous patient work, building systems that return phosphorus to the soil from which our food was born. That means better sanitation design, financing to bridge costly retrofits, education for farmer standards so a recycle label is a promise, not a marketing trick. International agreements keeping weapons out of chemistry shipments, flowing to those who need them most. Finally, humility before an element that will not be gobbled or banished, only stewarded. A small, consoling image helps. Trace a single atom of phosphorus through history. Find it in comet dust and ancient bowl ash, in match smoke and the slow turn of an ATP molecule in a mitochondrion. In the eyes of a farmer, at dawn the ledger of a phosphate company's balance sheet. It moves, it accumulates, it returns. Our task is to design the route it may take, so the journeys are life-affirming, not ruin. We will need laws and laboratories, markets and municipal planners, teachable farmers, cautious chemists. We will need to remember past hard lessons, the price of cheap convenience, the cruelty of ignoring worker suffering. Build systems making those mistakes less likely to be repeated. We close not with a neat fix, none exists, but with a set of quiet convictions. Treat phosphorus as circulating wealth, not an endless flow. Build infrastructure that captures, sanitizes, returns. Regulate chemicals that are misused, care for those who make and apply them. Inscribe safety and justice into the ways we feed ourselves. The element will not repent. It will keep doing what it does, making bones from mineral, carrying energy inside cells. Our governance, modest and steady, must match the elemental patience of phosphorus itself. In that perhaps is the lost gentle irony. The devil's element asks not for dominion, but for stewardship.